I'm making this interview in representation of the Translation Studies Unit of the Hungarian Applied Linguists Association, MONYE in short. In fact, that of a special offshoot, #Transpub. And Transpub is a relatively new initiative, and the scholars involved would like to disseminate knowledge about translation and interpreting studies among fellow scholars, PhD students and trainees. This is our first international mission, and we wanted this interview to serve as a kind of food for thought for colleagues back home. And we hope to continue this discussion in Budapest in an online format and involve Hungarian colleagues active in the field of translation and interpreting research and/or training. And I am at the University of Vienna, and I have the honor to be with Professor Franz Pöchhacker, who has accepted our invitation to do this interview and to talk about interpreting studies. Thank you, Franz, for accepting this interview.
Thank you for having the interview. Yes.
Just to start the first question, I have to go back some 20 years ago when we first met, when I was working on the recipe book From Preparation to Performance. I was the editor, and you contributed with a paper which had the very same title, The Current State of Interpreting Research. Now, how do you see the past 20 years? What kind of milestones do you think deserve to be mentioned along the bumpy road of interpreting studies?
That is a big question. 20 years worth of interpreting research in review. And I think it's interesting, if we remember correctly, that book strictly focused on, or mainly focused on conference interpreting. And in that article, when I said I talk about interpreting research, I usually put conference in brackets before interpreting, so conference interpreting research. And I think that has been the major shift, the major change. It's not an individual milestone, but it's a major change that our field has broadened and expanded to include community-based settings of interpreting. So when we say, what about interpreting research, nowadays we tend to think conference settings are one domain, but there are legal settings, healthcare settings, sign language interpreting. So this kind of expansion and broadening is the most significant development in the past 20 years, I think. But if we wanted to think about individual milestones, it's interesting that your book, the recipe book, came out in 2003, and in the following year, 2004, several major significant books were published, and I like to talk about this year 2004 as sort of the annus mirabilis, the glorious year of interpreting research, because you have books like Ebru Dirika doing a study on conference interpreting, but showing that the role of conference interpreters goes beyond neutrality and just being a message converter. And so she pointed us to the kind of agency and interventions that can also be seen in conference interpreting. And there was David Sawyer, 2004, with a major study, a fundamental study on curriculum in interpreter education. And Claudia Angelelli, with two books actually published, one an ethnography-based study on healthcare interpreting, very significant, but also an online survey that she conducted among conference interpreters and legal interpreters and healthcare interpreters in the United States and in Canada and in Mexico. So this is a beautiful example of this broadening toward other fields. And immodestly enough, in that same year, 2004, the first edition of my textbook on interpreting studies, Introducing Interpreting Studies, was also published. So those are a few milestones at the beginning of that period. And in terms of publication milestones, we realized that in 2015, Routledge had taken a major interest in reference volumes, reference books in the field of translation and interpreting studies, and they put out in the same year, amazingly, a handbook of interpreting edited by Holly Mickelson and René Jourdanet, and the Encyclopedia of Interpreting Studies was also published in that same year. And as we know, more recently, We've seen a spate of handbooks published by Routledge, one handbook on conference interpreting, another handbook on public service interpreting. So these are really major milestones in reflecting and putting together, compiling the state of the art in interpreting research. That leads me to think about this period as kind of a period of consolidation, where we don't only have individual books and authors, but where the field kind of is showcasing what it has achieved on the various topics.
Thank you. Well, the next question concerns the research topics, and I was wondering whether you can identify the most researched topics, maybe over the past 20 years, or maybe you can just focus on what's going on right now. The most researched and perhaps the less researched topics, so this could serve as a kind of food for thought for PhD students, how they could proceed with their work or what they should look into.
That is a question, on the one hand, almost impossible to answer. On the other hand, it would be a beautiful proposition for a bibliometric study. We have these bibliometric resources, there are indexed journals and citation databases. So one should, in order to give a serious answer, we would need to buckle down and do a bibliometric analysis and categorize publications by domains and topics. Some of these studies have been put out. But it always depends which database you use and which time frame and which kinds of journals. Is it English only? Is it in all other languages as well?
Yeah, the range is too broad.
It is difficult to do. Even if you do a bibliometric study, there are all these factors influencing the results. But right intuitively, offhand, some... also speaking as a co-editor of the journal, interpreting, thinking of the kinds of submissions that we get, and they really cover a broad range. It's hard to identify kind of a hot topic, but one answer I could give would be the concern with cognitive load in simultaneous interpreting. That seems to be a major topic if we just pick out one of many possible topics in the area of conference interpreting. And in the field of public service or dialogue interpreting, maybe multimodality, multimodal resources, gesture, gaze, body posture in interaction, in face-to-face interaction, interpreter-mediated interaction would be some other topics that seem to have attracted major attention. But I'm not even sure that would show up as a result of bibliometric studies. Because this might be a bit provocative, but if you actually did a broad-based bibliometric analysis, you might find out that the most researched topic is consecutive interpreting between English and Chinese. By sheer numbers and quantities of scholars who have recently joined the interpreting research community with a Chinese background, and their consecutive is a major topic. It is not so much of a hot topic in the so-called West. We know that some researchers have made significant contributions to that notion, like the choice of language and note-taking. Your work is still widely cited. But most of the work tends to focus on simultaneous conference interpreting, which is also where the professional market seems to be, but not in all regions of the world. And so, depending which databases, which languages, that impression of which are the most researched topics might go one way or another. It might be as difficult to say which are the least or the less researched topics, but one that I have come across because I was asked to write about it recently is relay interpreting. Judged by the frequency of occurrence and its relevance in, let's say, the European Parliament, especially with languages like Hungarian, relay interpreting, having a pivot and working into the B language, all of that hasn't attracted nearly as much research as one would expect, because it's such a complicated double phase, dual phase process, and so that would be one example.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And in terms of PhD projects, MA projects, my answer has been very simple and clear over the years. do a study, choose a topic, first of all, that is of greatest interest, and that might be very diverse. If you have an interest in medical stuff or legal, or that might guide students, MA students and doctoral students. And then don't be afraid to be opportunistic in the sense of where could I get access to material, where could I work with people that I need in order to design a study. There are many hurdles of access to authentic performances, recordings, access to people with a survey. So any door that you think might be more open for you than for your colleagues, for personal connections or because you're working with some institution or organization, I think that's the pragmatic way of approaching it. I wouldn't choose the topic from a list of whatever Pöchhacker says is the hot topic nowadays, because it might be a great topic, but you don't have the methods or the skills or the access, the material, the resources to actually do a good study. So I would leave that open and see what kinds of assets you can find in a PhD student, and then design it from there, because there's no shortage of under-researched topics.
Okay, maybe off the record, because we are talking about this, I can tell you about the new initiative that was actually initiated by Kinga Claudi at the PhD school in Budapest, the translation studies doctoral school. They compiled a volume, and actually it will be 3 volumes, where they collected or invited the Hungarian specialists of different topics in the field of translation and interpreting studies to make a summary of the topic they research, make a list of the most important books that the PhD students should read, and maybe identify some of the research opportunities for them. So this is a huge compilation of ideas. The first volume has been, obviously in Hungarian, published, but I think it's a good initiative for many other doctoral schools to help their PhD students.
That is such a great idea. That is an excellent initiative. I think that book should be translated into German. And I will talk to my colleagues.
I will tell Kinga, and we'll be talking about it. We'll see what the second and third volume will contain, but I'll be the second one about note-taking. But we have lots of scholars with lots of ideas, so I think it's a nice
helpful.
Yes.
In a sense, and maybe it's immodest to claim that, but part of the purpose of my introductory textbook was also to give guidance or to show, give an overview of the various topics, the research questions that have been studied, to as orientation for especially MA students. There's a first part of the book that gives a broad overview of the field, but then there is a part 2 that has different topics and tries to bring together the most important and helpful sources on that topic, whether it's the profession or quality or discourse strategies, and then you can find the references and take it from there. So that is the same intention was also pursued with that part 2 of the introductory textbook, but that to do this in the language and maybe also take advantage of Hungarian literature is such a beautiful initiative. Congratulations.
Okay, thank you. I will pass the word to the editors. Most of us who do research, and I think it's true for everyone, are involved in education, interpreter education. And therefore it's very essential for us to know that the research we do has some impact on training. So can you mention some recent empirical findings which have either a direct impact on education, which we can take into the classroom and say, well, this has been proven by research, this is how we should do it. Anything that comes to mind on that front?
This will be very provocative, but I think my short answer would be no. And the topic has been out there for quite some time. Daniel Gilles has written about it. What is the connection between the research we produce and education and training? Does the research really help? Does it help us improve our training practices? And frankly, I'm not even sure that this connection is so justified, because we are a field of study. We're supposed to understand the phenomenon of interpreting more deeply, more profoundly, and that is kind of basic research that we should be doing on interpreting. And ideally, if we find out more about how interpreting works, we can read that kind of research and use it in explaining to students why some problems occur and what can be done. But specific research that targets the training or improved training practices, that kind of research is available, like the effectiveness of number drills or the effect of memory training, or paraphrasing exercises, and then you try to do a longitudinal study and see whether if you force students to do certain exercises, will they perform better than a reference group. But it's very challenging. Students are in small groups usually, and they're quite diverse with different backgrounds, and you can never be sure you can come up with results that say, aha, we found this, and that's why we will adapt our training accordingly. I think there are some interesting studies, including some master's theses that we've done here in Vienna, for instance, on feedback. We have a beautiful study asking students and the teachers what they think about giving good feedback. And there's some common ground, but there's also some expectations by students that are quite different from the practices that they have experienced with some teachers, with some languages. And so that research in this microcosm of our department is extremely helpful, because we can, this is interview based, anonymized of course, but then we can take it back to the teaching staff and say, see, some students would like more of this, or this should be avoided. So that would be an example. Or if you do a study on peer assessment, peer review, we have several master theses accompanying and looking into innovative teaching practices like team teaching, doing a consecutive class combining Portuguese and Italian, for instance. How does that work? What are the advantages or disadvantages? And so these master's thesis studies actually try to answer these questions, and those answers can immediately be taken up by the teaching staff and improved. But in terms of published research in international peer-reviewed journals, I think there we tend to focus on basic research, fundamental issues that do not immediately translate into improved teaching practices.
Yes. Okay. Now, talking about various ideas, all in all, how do you think interpreting studies is evolving? In what direction is it expected to go in the near future? I know it's difficult to answer, but how do you envisage this?
Well, I have sort of a clear vision. On the one hand, I would say, I mentioned there has been a period of consolidation and stable growth. More and more people are taking an interest and doing work of increasingly high quality, especially methodological standards, research design. We see improvement. So I think the field should be expected to progress along those lines. As a normal science, improving, doing more of the same. But the one major shift that I could envisage is a broadening of the field. We had an initial phase where we broadened from conference interpreting to include community-based interpreting, and now I think the topic of accessibility, some interpreting-like services or types of interpreting skills applied for the purpose of such things as speech-to-text interpreting or live subtitling. If we manage to broaden our notion of interpreting and include these, this will reflect, of course, in our training, but also in the research. And if I look at the master's thesis that we've done in recent semesters, we have had several on intralingual speech-to-text interpreting, as we like to call it, with using re-speaking. And so it's already happening that researchers are taking more of an interest in these newer types of interpreting. Whether we want to call it interpreting or say, no, this is accessibility, leave us alone, this is for somebody else to do, that's still, I think, under discussion.
There's one language involved.
But in many cases, it's intralingual.
Intralingual.
Yes.
I think this is the point when we have to mention the role of technology. And actually we were wondering, we compiled the questions together with my colleagues, we were wondering about the impact technologies is making on interpreting studies in general, computer-assisted interpretation. So are you using it already at Univi, these kind of techniques, and what can you say about the impact of these new technologies?
When we say computer-assisted, we usually mean software for terminology support originally, and now maybe speech recognition combined with these systems. I think we use terminological resources, but not to a major extent in interpreting. I would say that it has not had a great impact on our teaching practices. The core teaching practices in consecutive and simultaneous remain unchanged. Students are taking a great interest also in the course of thesis research, for instance, in using KI tools, but I don't see it taking up much time in training practices still. And I wouldn't expect it to really change training practices in interpreting in the near future. Not in the same way as we see this happening in computer-aided translation, where machine translation has made such major progress.
Big issue, yes.
But when we say how is technology affecting our profession and training, I see more of a role for remote interpreting. So technology for the remote delivery of interpreting services, that is something we need to quickly incorporate in our training so that students will be able to work from a platform, from a screen, in a simultaneous interpreting delivery platform, for instance, and that has already happened, willy-nilly, of course. During the pandemic, we were teaching in this mode, and that's staying. So I'm sure that teachers now do the on-site mode of live speech being interpreted in the room, but also using videos and trying to simulate the remote interpreting. So that is where it's already happening, and you couldn't teach without it. But using speech recognition and tools, I think many of these are still in a more or less experimental stage and not ready for a routine incorporation into teaching practices.
I think we are all experimenting with that, trying to incorporate it in our courses. Okay, you mentioned speech-to-text already, and here's a question more specifically about it. What impact do you think speech-to-text systems for real-time support of the interpreters have on the competencies needed for interpreters, like memory? Will these systems make any impact on competence development?
Good question. I'm not an expert on memory. We need to talk to people like Kilian Zeber, but I would say it won't have a major impact on the fundamental skills of interpreters. If anything, there will be more of a need for extreme multitasking, because in addition to listening, we will have to visually monitor the input and make judgments whether if we use an off-the-shelf automatic speech recognition system with, let's say, 80% accuracy, then we always need to make judgments what's rubbish and what can be used. And I wonder whether that additional effort makes good sense.
Yeah.
So in training and in professional interpreters' skills, I don't see it as changing the way we work. Again, much in contrast to translation, where for many people translation work has become post-editing work, where the machine can be trusted to do so much of the work so quickly. And in interpreting, I think the relationship is still different, where the human performance, the human processing is still the lion's share, and you can have some support, but there are some studies see this as there's an advantage in, for instance, accurately rendering numbers, but then you get distracted by the
wrong pronunciation of names.
Misrecognition.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
we wonder. I don't think a major impact on the way we use memory. No, we need more resources for attention management and multitasking. That's already evident even in traditional skills like simultaneous interpreting with text. So looking at a printed text and listening, it's a similar additional load, and that has been practiced for decades now, especially in settings like the United Nations. I don't think it has changed the kinds of cognitive skills that conference interpreters at the United Nations have been using.
Okay, all right. We had a brief talk yesterday about business interpreting, and you mentioned that this could be regarded as one of the least researched phenomena. And we had a question about it, namely whether business interpreting falls into the intersocial or the intrasocial category, or whether it's on the boundary. What would you say about that?
Good question. I would say it could be either. Typically, it would be intersocial, internationally, representatives of different languages, institutions, companies from different countries, sociocultural contexts, negotiating. It's very obvious, but it could also happen within a multilingual society. For instance, if there's a deaf entrepreneur trying to talk to a bank and talking business, then there would be a sign language interpreter, but that's of course a community-based and intrasocial communication scenario. So it really depends on the scenario. But typically, I think trade and international business or trade and business negotiations where different languages and cultures are involved would almost by definition be international, intersocial relations.
Okay. Well, to be a little bit more personal, I would like to ask you, or somebody from the colleagues wanted to know whether for you, who were the key authors back then, when you started your research career, and to what extent do the works of these authors still influence current interpreting research? This is how the question goes.
That is a very nice question and easy to answer. Back then, as you said, that was in my case 1990, around 1990, and the answer is very clear. Daniel Gilles, the driving force for the renewal and internationalization of research into interpreting, was the key figure. And I remember I was still in the United States at the time. In 1988 I went up from Monterey to, was it Seattle? Yes, Seattle, to an ATA conference, and I heard him speak. He presented an overview of research on conference interpreting, and he became my key author and kind of mentor then. And then when I started doing my work, obviously he provided the guidance. He said, okay, the Paris school, Zeleskovich, that's nice and well, but we need to go forward. We need to be empirical, international, interdisciplinary, and I took up that message and ran with it. So definitely the most influential author. I will add one more name, which I never tire of giving credit to this person, a colleague, an interpreter who did a master's thesis in the early 1980s, Catherine Stenzel. Catherine Stenzel did this master's thesis about the process of simultaneous interpreting, and she was aware of German functionalist translation theory, Reis, Vermeer, Hönig, Kussmaul, and used that to describe the process of simultaneous interpreting, and I found that increasingly, extremely inspiring. And of course, she only did the master's thesis. I corresponded with her sporadically afterwards, but she was mainly a practitioner and didn't pursue research, so she couldn't be regarded as an author with a lasting influence on the field. But I need to give her credit that it was only a master's thesis, but for me it was a major source of inspiration, encouraging me to combine translation theory and the more cognitive approaches that Daniel Gilles, the empirical approaches that he was pursuing. And the extent to which this author, Daniel Gilles, is still influential, it's an interesting question if we link it up with the observation that we have gone beyond conference interpreting as a focus of our studies in the field, and if we accept the fact that Daniel has stuck with his major area of emphasis, which is conference interpreting, then automatically his influence for the field as a whole, or the new developments, could not be increasing, because he has chosen to mainly focus on conference interpreting, whereas there are so many different developments in other areas.
Okay. Now, a relatively new and rather negative trend is what I would like to ask you about, and it's the predatory publishing practice or phenomenon. Is it a real threat in our field? What do you think about it? Is there something we can do about it?
I see it as a real threat, but I have to admit that I only became aware of it as the co-editor of the journal through a plagiarism case. Mm-hmm. So I would assume that most of us remain largely unaware that this predatory publishing is going on. We are a very small research community. We have a few publishers, a number of journals that we are aware of, and I don't see any issues with these journals. So we are in a safe space, it seems. But if you look toward the fringes, as we were forced to, because we found plagiarized articles published in Interpreting, just changing a few names and publishing it in a handbook, published by whom? And so we chanced upon this publisher and said, what kind of publisher would do this kind of thing or would permit it? And then based on this one case and looking into these practices, we became aware of an enormous number of predatory publishers also working in the social sciences and in what they call languages and literature, English and language and literature, linguistics. And so there's enormous potential for predatory publishing in translation, because whenever you say languages, translation, they think that, naive authors might think that these journals which solicit you and they send us your work and we will publish immediately and all of that, open access, with or without a charge involved, could be tempted to publish in the wrong kinds of journals. So how do we counteract that? I think it's a real threat. I think we should all make our junior scholars aware of that, or even our senior scholars more aware of that. We try to do that by writing an editorial in the journal Interpreting on the occasion of its 25th anniversary, more or less, and raise that issue. And that has drawn a major response. And some people thought, I was not aware. Some experienced researchers says, I never thought about predatory publishers. And once you scratch that surface, you discover the depths of that phenomenon. I realized that in the biomedical and engineering fields, this is much worse because it's a bigger field and but maybe easier to control in our field. But we all need to be aware of it, and education of our master students and PhD students and all of our colleagues is the best antidote. There are still journals, I receive solicitations every other day, it seems. They would address me and say, please send us your work and we will publish your work. And I shudder to think that other colleagues get the same messages and really fall for it and send their articles to such publishers.
So we have to be careful, and perhaps the message should be passed on to our fellow scholars to pass the message on to their students.
Absolutely.
And that's the best we can do.
I think if you had a discussion among colleagues, who has been receiving them, how do you deal with them, do you know of any cases where people do get involved? Because there's also a gray zone. There are these extreme cases, they don't even get their spelling right in their solicitation letters, and so you know that this cannot easily be good. But there is a gray area of journals where you cannot be so sure that this is absolutely unacceptable. Or you see some colleagues whose names you do recognize, and they happen to edit a special issue for a journal like that, and then you think, well, if he or she is doing this, maybe that publisher is okay, maybe that journal is okay after all, and so it can be tricky to make that decision. But it's good to talk about it, to raise the issue, to discuss things and exchange experiences, and I think we can hopefully stave off that major threat to, what is it, to quality and academic integrity. It's not only plagiarism, but it's poor research, it's junk research, things that should never be published because they have not been reviewed or revised or improved or brought up to standards. They're just published because they were sent to a publisher without reading.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about China. China is an interesting place for interpreting. It's a huge market and a quite unique market for interpreting. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? What's happening in China? We can see a huge number of publications coming in quality papers as well. What do you know about China and interpreting?
Well, that could be the topic of an interview. Really, everybody's aware that the importance of China in so many ways has been increasing. And so by sheer numbers, if you hear numbers like more than 250 or by now more than 300 postgraduate training programs, master's programs, imagine the number of teachers involved, and we tend to think that if you teach in a program you're expected to have a PhD, so you do a PhD on translation or interpreting, and if you have not 15 training programs, maybe like in Hungary, or 3 like in Austria, but 300, then by sheer numbers, the weight of this research community is very significant, and also the motivation and the level of commitment. You get innovation, you get amazing use of statistics and huge numbers, experiments, surveys with hundreds of students. We could never come up with these students because they mainly focus on a language pair, Mandarin Chinese and English, and so all these students are available for systematic, empirical, quantitative studies. How could we ever match that in an EMCI program, for instance, where we have a handful of special students? So that makes China amazingly different. And another major difference is the state involvement. Mm-hmm. There is a state-organized infrastructure. There are certification testing. It's all controlled by, well, ultimately the Communist Party, but by the state agencies and decision makers. And if you think of the notion of a bipolar world, maybe the United States representing the West or leading the West, and then China as an other force, in the United States, you don't have any of that. You don't have any policy that it will be important to cultivate interpreting skills. And in fact, there's one initiative at Beihai, at one of the centers in China. They have a program called the, National Translation Competence Assessment. So it's research trying to quantify the capabilities of the nation of China in the field of interpreting. So how many interpreters do we have? How many training schools? How many researchers do we have? How many agencies and how many events? It's a very complex notion, but just it's beautifully reflecting this policy thing. It's obviously a major research project, needs to be approved by the higher ups and the hierarchies, and that's actually happening. Mm-hmm. So you have this state involvement in promoting the field. And training programs, of course, need to be approved, certification, and the market on the ground is still there, because if you have business negotiations, you will not find too many people who easily communicate in English. Mm-hmm. So consecutive interpreting and liaison interpreting is still playing a much greater role compared to maybe Europe.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How interesting. Now, going back to your work, there was this question, and I'm also very much interested whether you're planning a new edition of the Routledge Encyclopedia of Interpreting Studies.
I am not actively planning it, knowing how much work it involves. And it took 1.5 years of my academic productivity, and so if it needed to be done at the initiative of the publisher, if the publisher felt it should be done, I'm not actively planning it. Mm-hmm. And I also wonder what role these recent comprehensive handbooks would be playing in this regard, because mm-hmm. we have the good fortune of having very up-to-date comprehensive handbooks on community interpreting, on conference interpreting. Is there such a pressing need to compile our basic knowledge about interpreting in yet another updated encyclopedia? I'm not quite sure how the publisher envisages the relationship between this kinds of handbooks and the encyclopedia, but if it needed to be done, And if there is really room for it on the market or a need for it, it would need to be done again with a team of collaborators. I had strong support of Nadia Grbic as an associate editor, but still, who knows whether all these contributors would be available again. I think it was more than 120 colleagues worldwide chipping in, and it's a major undertaking, but we'll see.
Okay, what sort of projects do you work or are you currently working on now, if not this? Anything that you can tell us about that?
Yeah, it's as you said, if not this, if I took this on, I wouldn't be talking about research projects of my own. And so right now I am taking more of an interest in video remote interpreting. I'm conducting a survey among practicing video remote interpreters about their working conditions, their experiences, the challenges on the job. And another topic is, as I've mentioned, interpreting and accessibility, speech-to-text services, maybe comparing the usefulness of human speech-to-text interpreting to machine speech-to-text services. Yeah, that would be the two main topics of research that I'm currently pursuing.
Okay. I think it's very fitting to close our interview with a new book that has been published in tribute to you, entitled Introducing New Hypertext on Interpreting, and the volume is in front of you. Maybe you want to show it to the camera and say a few words about it, because the book launch or session, or how I should call it, happened yesterday, so it's a relatively new result.
Absolutely. The book is here because I left it here last night after the book presentation ceremony, kindly organized by the editors of this Festschrift volume, or volume in tribute. And yesterday was the first time I actually saw this book. It was a major surprise that was made late last year on the occasion of my 60th birthday, but the volume in print took some more time, and now it's out and it was presented. And last night, instead of going to bed early, I tried to leaf through it, and I'm so impressed with those interesting contributions by amazing colleagues. So that's a very touching acknowledgement of the work that I've been trying to do for over 30 years here at the University of Vienna, and done by dear colleagues as editors and contributors. It's the greatest tribute that more than I could ever have hoped for. So I hope it's not only this kind of function, but also contains, as it is a volume in the Benjamin's Translation Library series, it does contain research, new innovative studies, papers, chapters that I hope will be useful to many readers in the future.
I think this volume proves that you are and have been a source of inspiration for many scholars. And thank you very much for the interview, Franz. It's been a pleasure. And I wish you good luck with your projects and publications and activities in the next few decades to come.
Thank you. Same to you. Good luck, and thanks for this interview. Best wishes for the event and taking the discussion further.
Thank you.